So tell me a little bit about what we know regarding Jack Smith's appearance today. Glenn.
Well, it's been going on for about 2.5 hours. We've had a couple of breaks, I think 3 breaks, in which Smith was chased around the halls and he walked away silently without commenting. I think the most noteworthy thing that happened in public was a Fox crew nearly followed Jack in the House of Representatives today, which would have made news. But what we are hearing generally about the testimony behind closed doors is initially it has focused on the toll data that Smith and Company in the special counsel's office had requested from these 8 to 10 Republican senators regarding their interactions with the White House on or around January 6, 2021. That seems to have been the tenor. Generally speaking, the body language inside the room, I'm told from several people, has been pretty relaxed. It hasn't been overtly confrontational. And I spoke with a couple of the Democratic members of the committee who were in there who seemed to feel very, very confident that Smith was handling himself well, almost to the point where they were had a tone of mockery about the disparity between Smith's capacity to answer questions and the Republican staff members' capacity to ask them.
Is it staff members that are asking these questions from Republicans, or is it Republican lawmakers, Glenn?
It's a combination of both. It's committee, the way that these depositions typically work, or it's committee staff working in conjunction with members. And that generally, we should say, the biggest issue here is that this is taking place behind closed doors. Jack Smith had wanted to have this happen in public.
Well, it's been going on for about 2.5 hours. We've had a couple of breaks, I think 3 breaks, in which Smith was chased around the halls and he walked away silently without commenting. I think the most noteworthy thing that happened in public was a Fox crew nearly fell in the House of Representatives today, which would have made news. But what we are hearing generally about the testimony behind closed doors is initially it is focused on the toll data that Smith and Company in the special counsel's office had requested from these 8 to 10 Republican senators regarding their interactions with the White House on or around January 6th, 2021. That seems to have been the tenor. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. Generally speaking, the body language inside the room, I'm told from several people, has been pretty relaxed. It hasn't been overtly confrontational. And I spoke with a couple of the Democratic members of the committee who were in there who seemed to feel very confident that Smith was handling himself well, almost to the point where they had a tone of mockery about the disparity between Smith's capacity to answer questions and the Republican staff members' capacity to ask them. Is it staff members that are asking these questions from Republicans, or is it Republican lawmakers, Glenn? It's a combination of both. It's committee staff working in conjunction with members. And generally, we should say the biggest issue here is that this is taking place behind closed doors. Jack Smith had wanted to have this happen in public. Jim Jordan, it is well known on the Hill, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, had real concerns about Smith being given a public platform to make the case against President Trump that he was denied making in court. So there's a deep political calculation that went into this to keep Smith out of the public view. So that's interesting. Let's bring in Carol Leonig, MSNBC senior investigative reporter. So Carol, what Glenn just said there is interesting because on the one hand, you have Jim Jordan not wanting Jack Smith to lay out what his investigation found, lay out the case that he had against Donald Trump that he was denied. But on the other hand, still projecting that Jack Smith is a political animal, this was a political prosecution, that he is corrupt and that they need to question him behind closed doors. Those two things are in conflict with each other. They absolutely are, Katie. And you know, it's been a great source of frustration for Jack Smith and his legal counsel and team, and indeed his entire former special counsel office. Most of them, if they still worked at the Department of Justice, have been fired by Donald Trump. but it's been a source of frustration because Jack Smith being able to articulate the evidence that he gathered to the degree he's able to discuss that which is already public, for him to narrate what he found could be very devastating publicly for Donald Trump, because it's a platform at which he can say, here's what we found, here's why we thought there was evidence of a crime, and here's why a grand jury indicted Donald Trump both on illegally interfering in a free and fair election, conspiring to block the rightful victory of Joe Biden, and intentionally hoarding and withholding national defense information. And by that I mean classified documents at his home in Mar-a-Lago when he was no longer president and no longer had any right to them. I want to say one more thing, Katie, though you didn't ask it. I know it is going to be your next question. Part of what the big worry is about a closed session for Jack Smith and his team, as we have learned in our reporting, is that this will be used in a way to trip him up or to trap him. In other words, to cherry pick things he has said and try to use them publicly to, once again, as the Republicans appear determined to do, rewrite history. The evidence that Donald Trump withheld intentionally classified records was overwhelming. There was video surveillance. There were text messages with him and his aides asking them to move those records from a place right before they were supposed to be searched by his own attorney. The evidence is overwhelming in pictures and in testimony from witnesses. And so Jack Smith being able to articulate that would be very difficult. But the Republicans do not want to hear that story. They want to choose the evidence they want to present to the public after they sit down with him in a closed hearing. Smith wanted to lay this out. Could he do so publicly on his own volition? You know, the rule here, Katie, is that a former DOJ prosecutor or official must confer with the department before speaking before Congress, before speaking publicly about the events that they learned about during their job. That is what they're supposed to do. My understanding from our reporting is that Jack Smith did not get very clear guidance from the Department of Justice. It was at times vague about what he could discuss, other than to say you can talk about what is already public. So the Republicans, this is a memo shared by Chuck Grassley, they don't believe that the special counsel had probable cause, established probable cause for the search warrant for classified records at Mar-a-Lago. What do you make of that assertion from the Republicans, Tom? Well, the basis for the Republican suspicion that he may have lacked probable cause in large part lies in some back and forth emails among FBI agents in the Justice Department as they were preparing to execute the warrant on Mar-a-Lago. I think where the Republicans may face a challenge, though, is really bringing out a lot of the evidence that Smith had that justified issuing and executing the search warrant. Because as Carol and others have reported, Smith is under very severe restrictions from the Justice Department, from court orders, from ordinary rules governing the secrecy of grand jury proceedings and the like. He is heavily restricted in precisely what he can say. And I think that will make it difficult for the Republicans to try to go down that road, to try to show the public that Smith lacked probable cause to execute the warrant, because everyone knows that Smith just isn't free to disclose a lot of the evidence and information that led him to make the decisions that he did. What about the public record that we saw? I mean, we saw that surveillance video of Donald Trump's aide, Walt Nauta, moving boxes back into a storage unit. We got a lot of the back and forth in the indictment. We got a lot of the evidence that Jack Smith had been able to accumulate on the basis after the FBI raid to prove that Donald Trump had done something wrong, was obstructing justice, and was hoarding those documents. From what you've seen of the public record, is there a lot of there for this Republican assertion? I think there's a lot of there, frankly, from the Justice Department's perspective, in terms of the evidence that they had that would support a finding of probable cause, based again on material that already is in the public record and that Jack Smith presumably could talk about in his deposition. But what I will say is that I think the Republicans do have a fair point, that it does appear there was some serious internal disagreement within the Justice Department, within the FBI, about the propriety of executing a search warrant on Mar-a-Lago. That isn't always unusual. You often will have cases where there's a lot of internal division and dissent and disagreement about whether a search warrant is proper. But I do think the Republicans have a fair point, particularly if you have career FBI officials who are expressing concern, and those concerns were overridden by Biden political appointees. I think that's fair ground. Not to say that there's no probable cause, but it's a fair point. Let me allow Carol to jump in. You know, I totally understand why somebody wants to say it's a fair point, but I'd just like to put out what is already well publicly established. And no offense meant to anyone here, because the Republicans in this situation have cherry-picked information, and I feel like I know very exhaustively what happened in this situation. So they've chosen emails from May and June where FBI officials were debating probable cause. Totally healthy, just as you say, Tom. Totally healthy to have a debate back and forth. But that radically changes in July after the FBI obtains this surveillance tape. The FBI asked to look at this surveillance tape from Mar-a-Lago, and it radically changes where there are documents which the Republicans have not released in this data dump that show FBI officials at the highest level, at the mid-level, all agreeing we've got probable cause. Now it's so clear. And we report this in my book, Insurrection with Aaron Davis. I can point you to the page in it. But also, two more important facts that Republicans have left out here in this story, and Glenn knows them well as well. A judge, an Article 3 judge, signed off that there was probable cause on August 5th for this raid to go forth on August 8th. And then the end-all, be-all of probable cause. We went from probability to reality when the FBI agents raided that property in a surprise court-approved search and left with hundreds of pages of top-secret records. The evidence of a crime was probable in August, and the evidence of a potential crime was actually collected. Glenn, if the Democrats win in 2026, when control of either the House or the Senate or both very much up in the air, are we going to see Jack Smith testifying publicly? Oh, I think that would be a given. The question that I would also raise is, given this predicate of prosecuting the prosecutors, investigating the investigators, does this open the door? Have the Republicans actually opened the door to Democrats doing the same thing to Lindsey Halligan, to Ed Martin, to Jeanine Pirro, to Todd Blanche, to Pam Bondi? Have they created a sort of moral hazard for themselves once Democrats, or if Democrats, regain control of either house of the legislature or the presidency? Let me add crucial context here, because what we're witnessing is Republicans desperately trying to control a narrative they know will destroy them if the full truth comes out. First, understand why this testimony was kept behind closed doors. Jim Jordan knows that if Jack Smith had a public platform, he would systematically lay out the overwhelming evidence of Trump's crimes, evidence that convinced a grand jury to indict, evidence that meets the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Jordan can't let that happen, because Republicans have spent months telling their base that Smith is a corrupt political hack running a witch hunt. If Smith gets to publicly explain the evidence, that narrative collapses instantly. People would see that Smith is a professional prosecutor who followed the facts wherever they led. So they bring him in behind closed doors. They can control what gets released. They can cherry pick quotes. They can spin his testimony however they want. And most importantly, they can prevent him from making a devastating public case against Trump. But even behind closed doors, it's not going well for Republicans. Multiple Democratic members said Smith was handling himself brilliantly. They described mockery of the disparity between Smith's capacity to answer questions and Republican staff's capacity to ask them. That tells you Smith is running circles around them. The focus on phone records from Republican senators is particularly interesting. This is about toll data showing which Republican members of Congress were in contact with the White House on or around January 6th as they tried to delay certification. Smith saying, "I didn't choose those members, President Trump did," is devastating because it shows Trump coordinating with specific members to execute the criminal scheme. Carol Leonig's point about the catch-22 Republicans created is perfect. They claim Smith is political and corrupt, but they won't let him publicly defend himself or explain his decisions. Those positions are contradictory. If Smith is corrupt, you'd want public testimony to expose that. The fact they're keeping it private proves they're afraid of what he'd say. And Carol is absolutely right that Smith wanted to articulate the evidence publicly. Video surveillance of Walt Nauta moving boxes. Text messages showing Trump and his aides conspiring to hide documents before his own attorney searched. testimony from witnesses, pictures of classified documents in a bathroom, a ballroom, at a social club. The evidence is overwhelming and public. Smith wants to explain it. Republicans won't let him because that explanation would be devastating for Trump. Now let's address the Republican claim about probable cause for the Mar-a-Lago search. This is pure cherry picking, and Carroll destroys it completely. Yes, there were emails in May and June showing FBI officials debating probable cause. That's normal and healthy. Prosecutors and agents should debate whether evidence supports a warrant. But Republicans stopped there. They didn't mention what happened next. In July, the FBI obtained surveillance video showing Trump's aide moving boxes. That changed everything. Suddenly, FBI officials at all levels agreed, we have probable cause. Documents Republicans won't release show that clear consensus. But here's what's most important. An Article 3 federal judge reviewed the evidence and signed the warrant on August 5th. That's not a political appointee. That's a Senate-confirmed federal judge who determined probable cause existed based on the evidence presented. And then the ultimate proof. They executed the search and found hundreds of pages of top-secret documents. They didn't find nothing. They didn't find questionable materials. They found exactly what they had probable cause to believe was there. Classified national defense information Trump had no right to possess. So Republicans are claiming there was no probable cause despite a federal judge approving the warrant and the search recovering exactly what was sought. That's not a legitimate argument. That's desperation. Tom's point about internal disagreement being overridden by political appointees would be concerning if it were true. But Carroll's reporting shows that's not what happened. After the surveillance video, career FBI officials at all levels agreed there was probable cause. This wasn't political appointees overriding career officials. This was everyone agreeing based on compelling evidence. The restriction on what Smith can discuss publicly is another way Republicans are rigging this. Smith is bound by DOJ rules, court orders, grand jury secrecy. He can only talk about what's already public. That prevents him from providing additional context or evidence that would further strengthen the case. But even limited to public information, Smith can make a devastating case because what's already public is overwhelming. The indictments lay out the evidence in detail. The surveillance footage is public. Witness testimony excerpts are public. Pictures of classified documents in absurd locations are public. Republicans are betting that keeping Smith behind closed doors and cherry-picking quotes will let them control the narrative. But they're forgetting something crucial. Smith can still give interviews. He can write op-eds. He can go on podcasts and news shows. He can make public statements. And Glenn's question about what happens when Democrats take back Congress in 2026 is crucial, because everything Republicans are doing to Smith now sets a precedent for what Democrats can do to Trump's corrupt prosecutors and lawyers when they have power. Pam Bondi, who's indicting people Trump told her to indict. Todd Blanche, Trump's criminal defense attorney, now running DOJ Criminal Division. Jeanine Pirro, Lindsey Halligan, Ed Martin. All of Trump's corrupt enablers could face the same treatment when Democrats control committees. Republicans are creating a moral hazard where investigating prosecutors becomes normalized. They think they're only doing it to their opponents, but it will come back on them when power shifts. And based on polling and special elections, power is shifting toward Democrats in 2026. So we're watching Republicans desperately try to discredit Jack Smith while preventing him from publicly defending himself. They're cherry-picking emails while ignoring surveillance footage and judicial approval. They're claiming no probable cause despite a search that recovered hundreds of classified documents. And they're doing all this behind closed doors because they know public testimony would destroy them, because Jack Smith is a professional prosecutor with overwhelming evidence. And Trump is a criminal defendant who's only free because he won an election before trial could proceed. Subscribe to follow this, because Smith will speak publicly eventually, whether through interviews or when Democrats retake Congress. And when he does, the full devastating case against Trump will finally be heard by the American people without Republican interference.